Okay, so what I'm here to talk to you this afternoon about is, in many respects, this is a method paper. I am going to be talking about les méthodes quantitatives, or whatever, or as they were described, and talk, I suppose, about, in particular, text mining. Which is the sort of large-scale analysis of texts that have recently, relatively recently anyway, in the last 10 or 15 years, been kind of liberated by quantification. I'm just going to put a timer on myself here, just so I keep to time. Since the millennium, and I will just go back there, apologies for that. Hey, how do I go back to the start? There we go. So since the millennium, history in general, but modern British political history in particular in 19th and 20th century, which is where I work, has been, I think, profoundly affected by the march of digitisation. We've had not only the publication of hundreds of millions of words of text, but also the semantic enhancement of that text. So it's not just a question of it simply being unprocessed. For example, parliamentary debates, trials, official papers, reports, and then, of course, the local and national press. And when I say the semantic enhancement, I mean, for example, in the case of Parliament, not just the actual words, but for us, for example, to be able to see which party, for example, a speaker is from, whether they are from the government and opposition, whether they are from a man or a woman. In other words, metadata being added to the text that enables us to more granularly analyse it. Local newspapers, for example, you might have geolocated data, for example, so we can actually pin specific kind of stories to particular locations. So it's not just its digitisation, it's also its semantic enhancement. Now, I think in the discipline in general, the traditional historian's challenge, if you like, which is what you might call source scarcity, has been replaced by one of abundance. There's now simply too much textual material to be able to read or even analyse in several lifetimes. The opportunity, and for me indeed the necessity, for computational analysis of this vast constellation of liberated data and a potential associated renaissance of clear metrics seems self-evident. Now, in other fields, text mining that I've described, and multivariate quantitative analysis of large data sets have installed so-called big data analysis at the heart of every academic field where it's viable. Every field, I would argue, apart from history. Now, in 1971, during what could be called the golden age of historical computing, where historians were analysing vast swathes of data in huge research teams in the quest for an all-explaining total historical model, few would have disputed Edward Shorter's prediction in The Historian and the Computer, published 1971, that tomorrow's historian would have to be able to program a computer to survive. For Shorter, the future scholar would abandon their book-lined study for the great flashing lights and great grey machines of the computer centre. 52 years later, something has happened, or rather not happened. The reasons, I think, for the failure of analytical computing in history are complex, but stem from a widespread epiphany in the 1980s concerning the ruinous cost and dependence on technicians, the over-reliance on arbitrary categorization, and the potential of this new history to dehumanize the past and its insensitivities to the ambiguities of language and discourse. Now, in the years that followed this abandonment of quantitative history in the 1980s, which really followed, I suppose, Lawrence Stone's very famous kind of intervention in 1979. Stone was previously an advocate and turned into a detractor, calling for a revival of the narrative, as he put it, which was, in a sense, even though he didn't acknowledge his debt to Foucault and Derrida, etc., he was almost taking a very leading step in standing back from this kind of quantitative history that had consumed so much manpower and so many millions of dollars. Now, in the years that have followed, the diminished band of what you would call quantitative computational historians have continued to contest the validity of Stone's critique, especially in light of technological developments. In 2014, Joe Gouldy and David Armitage published the Provocative History Manifesto. This argued that excessive specialization on small topics, neglect of the longue durée, the methodological conservatism stemming from a residual suspicion of clear metrics, had prevented historians from grasping what they saw to be a magnificent opportunity afforded by computational analysis of big data, which might reverse the discipline's decline in universities and the increasing marginalisation of history scholars in data-focused 21st century public debate. Now, their charge wasn't just one of technophobia, for neither Gouldy or Armitage, nor I, as an advocate of these techniques, would dispute that parts of Shorter's prophecy in The Historian of the Computer clearly have come true. Historians now all use computers, albeit through graphical user interfaces rather than programming. And these have transformed working practices, especially in the domains of source search and access, which have revolutionised the digital archive. Now, our complaint is that the vast majority of present-day historians are unwilling to turn to computer analysis, despite its self-evident transformative potential. Historians are often, and sometimes even proudly, quantophobic and uninterested in social scientific argumentative paradigms such as model building, variable control, or inferential statistics. Historians' natural suspicion, which I think is in many respects a very healthy one, of pre-agreed categorization and coding, as well as their preference for single-author publication, makes incremental or collaborative work the exception rather than the norm. Now, recent historians have, of course, been deeply interested in language, but in close reading by eye rather than the distant reading by machines, which leads to a skepticism of text mining and its association with linguistic categorization, empiricism, and automation via machine learning. Now, my critique applies even to, I think, a subfield like British political history, which is the area that I work on, where I think the potential for quantitative computerized analysis is particularly obvious. In this field, as I am sure is the case also in French political history, there's an abundance of numerical data sets and the digital access to billions of words of political texts with reliable optical character recognition supported by a rich historiography of political language, as well as numerous potential synergies with political sciences colleagues who are studying similar sources. Vast electoral and machine-readable parliamentary corpora remain unanalyzed. Cephology is now the exclusive property of political scientists, and data-led analysis of class is left to sociologists, and quantitative linguistic analysis tends to be performed by computer scientists or computational linguists. I would suggest that people in British political history could actually be pioneers in this field and open up new frontiers of digital analysis and maybe set an example for other historical fields. Now, in self-consciously digital circles, and as I say, I do want to try and be self-critical in this respect, sometimes the term Luddite is used to describe the prevailing attitude of historians to digital analysis. Now, I accept the term, but not the pejorative implications, because there's nothing wrong with being a Luddite in 1811 or now. There's no divine mandate to be progressive and to embrace technological change for its own sake. Similarly, there is no obligation to be optimistic about its ramifications for the historian's craft, or indeed for a traditional scholar to press for a digital future where his or her comparative advantage might be downgraded. Thus, the digital humanities focus since the millennium on creating large digital infrastructures, and especially in the field of parliamentary data that you see, has often been predicated on the attitude that if you build it, they will come. And that may be seen in retrospect to be rather naive. And their active advocacy of change overzealous. Digital scholars could instead have offered examples of computerized methodologies fruitfully contributing to established historical debates. And I think in British political history, there have been precious few actual examples of text mining delivering agenda-setting interventions in major historiographical debates. What there tends to be, and in many respects I'm also guilty of this, is method papers in niche outlets. In other words, I feel that people advocating these techniques have been preaching rather than proving. And I'm still going to be doing some preaching as well, I hasten to add. But maybe here's a little bit of very, very quick and dirty proof. So I'm just going to show you a few examples taken from my own research of what this kind of approach can bring. Now let's start very, very simply. Now, what I was interested in as a PhD student was the language of election speeches in Britain. And during Britain at this time, you have a very, very robust culture of public speech making. The main way of conducting campaigns is through candidates mounting the platform and making long speeches that are reported very faithfully in the contemporary provincial and national press. Now, it's possible, of course, to scan, and I did some of this manually, but now increasingly it is just simply available, that provincial press. In other words, to build up a corpus of these political speeches. And of course, you can subdivide them as well. You can divide them by political parties. We have stable political parties by the 1880s, so we're able to do that. You can divide them by location, and indeed whether the speakers are what you might call executive level, cabinet level speakers, or local politicians. And there are other things you could do too. So this was the fruits of some of my research, and I did some of this by a quite exhaustive sampling mechanism to try and get representative samples of various language groups, mainly looking here at political parties. So this graph you can see here are the Conservative and the Liberal parties in one case study region, East Anglia, the east of England essentially, other constituencies outside East Anglia, and national speakers. And those dates below are years where Britain had a general election. And what I'm interested in measuring here, and I appreciate this graph is not labelled, is mentions of words relating to imperialism and empire. Now, that vocabulary wasn't something that I just sort of decided upon. I, of course, took words such as imperialism and empire as a kind of a starting position, but I also used computational techniques to find associated language and also my own historical judgment of what should represent the language of imperialism, and there's a list of words that I am using as a proxy to represent it. They're not labelled on this diagram, alas, in order to get a not perfect but holistic measurement of this language to be able to compare on a simple level. And we find, I think, some interesting results through doing this in comparative subsamples of 50,000 words per group. So what do we see here? Well, there are some results that will not surprise historians of this period. There's loads of empire mentioned, lots of imperialism in 1900, which is, of course, the so-called khaki general election where Britain is fighting a war in southern Africa for the annexation of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. In 1906, it's an election all about colonial preference, whether Britain is going to effectively create a single market within the British Empire. And 1886, you have Irish Home Rule, which has imperial connotations. But there are some things in there that surprise historians a bit more. 1895 is more surprising. This is a crushing conservative victory that some historians have said was carried by imperialism. That they've taken 1895 and 1900 together as being examples of the sort of apogee of conservative success, and many historians have drawn a strong connection between imperialism and conservative electoral success in this period. But what we actually find is that 1895 seems to actually be one of the least imperial of any elections in this period. We can also track other kinds of issues as well, again they're not on this diagram, and show, for example, that actually relatively minor pieces of legislation, for example, those pertaining to the employment rights and structures of railway workers, actually are more mentioned in 1895 than imperialism. And that's a very, superficially quite sort of surprising kind of analysis. But I think that the point here is that we find that imperialism is an intermittent rather than constant kind of force at the heart of British elections, especially when we compare to other kinds of issues. So rather than being the age of imperialism dominating popular politics, we find imperialism is of intermittent rather than continual importance. Another thing we find that is interesting is about the parties. Now, many historians, especially those who've written on the Conservative Party, have tended to argue the Conservative Party talks about imperialism more than the Liberals, but there has been a bit of a resurgence in recent decades to say that, well, actually the Liberals had their own version of imperialism. It wasn't quite as obsessed with territorial expansion as the Conservatives, but they had a certain form of liberal kind of imperialism, especially in the 1890s. But what we find here is we can quantify that party versus party debate quite pleasingly. There's a difference between whether the Conservatives were ahead by miles on the Liberals of imperialism or whether they were only ahead, shall we say, by a short head, to use a horse racing terminology. We answer it here with quite pleasing precision. The Conservatives talk about imperialism twice as often as the Liberals. Now, so I'm just going to show you a few examples taken from my own research of what this kind of approach can bring. Now, let's start very, very simply. Now, what I was interested in as a PhD student was the language of election speeches in Britain. And during Britain at this time, you have a very, very robust culture of public speech making. The main way of conducting campaigns is through candidates mounting the platform and making long speeches that are reported very faithfully in the contemporary provincial and national press. Now, it's possible, of course, to scan, and I did some of this manually, but now increasingly it is just simply available, that provincial press. In other words, to build up a corpus of these political speeches. And of course, you can subdivide them as well. You can divide them by political parties. We have stable political parties by the 1880s, so we're able to do that. You can divide them by location, and indeed whether the speakers are what you might call executive level, cabinet level speakers, or local politicians. And there are other things you could do too. So this was the fruits of some of my research, and I did some of this by a quite exhaustive sampling mechanism to try and get representative samples of various language groups, mainly looking here at political parties. So this graph you can see here are the Conservative and the Liberal parties in one case study region, East Anglia, the east of England essentially, other constituencies outside East Anglia, and national speakers. And those dates below are years where Britain had a general election. And what I'm interested in measuring here, and I appreciate this graph is not labelled, is mentions of words relating to imperialism and empire. Now, that vocabulary wasn't something that I just sort of decided upon. I, of course, took words such as imperialism and empire as a kind of a starting position, but I also used computational techniques to find associated language and also my own historical judgment of what should represent the language of imperialism, and there's a list of words that I am using as a proxy to represent it. They're not labelled on this diagram, alas, in order to get a not perfect but holistic measurement of this language to be able to compare on a simple level. And we find, I think, some interesting results through doing this in comparative subsamples of 50,000 words per group. So what do we see here? Well, there are some results that will not surprise historians of this period. There's loads of empire mentioned, lots of imperialism in 1900, which is, of course, the so-called khaki general election where Britain is fighting the war in southern Africa for the annexation of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. In 1906, it's an election all about colonial preference, whether Britain is going to effectively create a single market within the British Empire. And 1886, you have Irish Home Rule, which has imperial connotations. But there are some things in there that surprise historians a bit more. 1895 is more surprising. This is a crushing conservative victory that some historians have said was carried by imperialism. That they've taken 1895 and 1900 together as being examples of the sort of apogee of conservative success, and many historians have drawn a strong connection between imperialism and conservative electoral success in this period. But what we actually find is that 1895 seems to actually be one of the least imperial of any elections in this period. We can also track other kinds of issues as well, again they're not on this diagram, and show, for example, that actually relatively minor pieces of legislation, for example, those pertaining to the employment rights and structures of railway workers, actually are more mentioned in 1895 than imperialism. And that's a very, superficially quite sort of surprising kind of analysis. But I think that the point here is that we find that imperialism is an intermittent rather than constant kind of force at the heart of British elections, especially when we compare to other kinds of issues. So rather than being the age of imperialism dominating popular politics, we find imperialism is of intermittent rather than continual importance. Another thing we find that is interesting is about the parties. Now, many historians, especially those who've written on the Conservative Party, have tended to argue the Conservative Party talks about imperialism more than the Liberals, but there has been a bit of a resurgence in recent decades to say that, well, actually the Liberals had their own version of imperialism. It wasn't quite as obsessed with territorial expansion as the Conservatives, but they had a certain form of liberal kind of imperialism, especially in the 1890s. But what we find here is we can quantify that party versus party debate quite pleasingly. There's a difference between whether the Conservatives were ahead by miles on the Liberals of imperialism or whether they were only ahead, shall we say, by a short head, to use a horse racing terminology. We answer it here with quite pleasing precision. The Conservatives talk about imperialism twice as often as the Liberals. Now, all of that's disconnected, fairly disconnected word counting. However, there are other ways in which you can start to bring in more qualitative analysis here. So this is a measure, a very, very simple one here, called lexical attraction. So if we take the keyword empire, we can see what other words are lexically attracted to that term. In other words, appear more often in the same sentences and the same clauses as, say, the word empire. And we can use something called the Mutual Information Score, the MI score. It's a very basic corpus linguists kind of device, this. And we find that the Conservatives, when they talk about empire, they are frequently talking in very emotive terms: dismemberment, disintegration, disruption, unity, glorious, etc. The Liberals are too, to an extent. But if we drop down to halfway down their list, we find much more, unless you're a linguist, uninteresting synsemantic kind of words: our, the, is, are, then, about, etc. And also the Liberal mutual information scores are quite a lot lower. So we find that not only do the Conservatives mention imperialism a lot more often than Liberals, when they mention it, they more reliably connect it to a much more sort of rhetorically charged set of keywords than the Liberals tend to do. So this is just an interesting way of looking at the imperialism question. That, of course, can be done alongside the traditional reading and analysis of sources. It doesn't replace it, it merely acts in complement to it. And that's something that I've done, very much kind of throughout my earlier kind of research. Now, here's something completely different. This is where we start getting a bit more aggressively empirical. Completely different topic, completely different source base. Allow me to explain. This is the British House of Commons. And what I was interested in here was measuring the differences in speaking patterns between male and female parliamentarians. So women appear in the British Parliament after the election of 1918 for the first time, following enfranchisement. And after the election of 1945, there are about 20 women MPs, and that's a group that roughly stayed the same until around the 90s. Since that time, we had a very rapid expansion of women MPs who have moved from a very small minority to a very large minority, about 1/3 of the House of Commons as of today. What I wanted to ask was very simply this: is it the case that, as many scholars, especially in the political science and indeed even gender studies, had argued, that women MPs are much more likely to talk about women than male MPs are? And essentially, by looking at, again, an empirically derived constellation of words, they're things like women, girl, mother, etc., we can see here that between these different parliaments in the House of Commons, the grey graph there is women talking about women, the black graph is men talking about women. Yes, we can confirm women talk about women about 4 times as often as men talk about women, which is interesting. The other thing that I think becomes interesting is that distinction starts to fall away, especially after 1997. Now, in 1997, very famously, Tony Blair came to power in Britain. And in that election, 120 women MPs were elected. It was a very big increase over previous elections. The reason for that, of course, was because a lot of Labour candidates won elections in places that they did not expect to win. And so, in a sense, it was partly accidental that a lot of women who were actually expected to lose ended up being elected, because this was such a huge victory for the British Labour Party. But then we find very interestingly that with this, and there are other metrics I'm measuring this with as well, and the trend is corroborated, that as the number of women increase in the House of Commons, as they move from a small minority to a large minority, they're actually less likely relative to talk about women, and as we'll see, another user constellation of female vocabulary relative to men. So this is again quite interesting, that rather than a larger women's lobby in the House of Commons allowing maybe women's issues or feminist issues to be more powerfully rhetorically expressed, is actually tended to reduce the gap between men and women. That is partly as a result of men moving towards women in their language patterns, as well as women moving towards men, I should hasten to add. Now, this is very difficult to see, so I'll just have to sort of explain this. So that was just counting very basic words there. But here's a more interesting kind of analysis. Comparing all women parliamentarians and all male parliamentarians through time, what are the kind of words that women use significantly more often than men across all of the parliaments from 1945 to 2015? In other words, can we get reliable lexical markers of women's language and indeed men's language? And we find, to be honest, a fairly sharp sort of gender stereotyped entrenchment. What are the female words? Number 1 is child. That's a word that's used significantly more often by women in all of the parliaments since 1945. Another one is woman, which shouldn't be surprising. Health, age, mother, care, family, husband, elderly, work, etc. The men words which are at slightly lower levels, of course, because men are the majority of the house. The men's favourite word is argument, which is... The second one is force, then proposition, corporation, which is pretty good, then defence, army, nuclear, British, states, military, and you go down to get other ones as well. Americans, a lot of these, air, sea, business, wrong, yeah, exactly. So there are terms relating to the military, but also terms to do with the structure of debate itself, proposition, opposition, argument. Those are robust markers of men's language. So you can take those male words and female words and then sort of plot the proclivity of different speakers to use those over time, which gives you, shall we say, a slightly more empirically derived measure of the difference between men's and women's vocabulary. And you see the same, that after 1997, these gendered divides start to start to be expressed at a smaller level. They're still quite large, and I'm sure would still be large even with current data. Third example. This was a little bit of both here. This is about electoral violence. Now, in elections in the 19th century, there was violence from time to time. Hired roughs disrupting meetings, occasionally much more severe violence, sometimes, mass fights, occasionally even murders as well. And despite Britain's general reputation as having a comparatively peaceful kind of, time of things in the 19th century. So I wanted to try and essentially measure this. Now, violence is inherently much more difficult to measure than these other things, because violence isn't necessarily something that appears in speeches in the same way, but it is reported in newspapers. So what we did, very simply put, was we used a machine learning algorithm that we fed on texts that were about violence, ones that we knew as historians to be like about a breakup of a political meeting, a fight, whatever it would be. And then once the computer had developed a way of being able to highlight articles that it thought were about this with quite a lot of fuzziness, we then gave that block of articles to a team of to actual human researchers to attempt to qualify, to attempt to say, well, did violence occur? Who were its perpetrators? And does the newspaper say that violence was instigated rather than merely just being cultural violence? And there are also ways with the instigated violence we've got of perhaps confirming that by looking at two newspapers of different size to see if they both agree it was instigated or whether only one of them says it's instigated. Because, of course, there can sometimes be a slight partisan skew towards if the Conservatives have a meeting breaking up, they'll say, well, the Liberals paid those thugs. But they may. Whereas if it were the case that it was a paid-for thing, the Liberals would probably just disassociate themselves with and say probably they were paid, it had nothing to do with us. So there's a way of quantifying this, and this project, which I did with colleagues at Durham, has probably taken. It's around the total corpus I think we've used here is approaching 40 billion words. So it's a really colossal corpus of the entire British provincial press from 1832 to 1914, and we are able to quantify now violence, not perfectly, and there are a lot of issues with this as well, like for example not counting the same events twice. But you'll see, but I'll skip on to the data. We have percentages of constituencies experiencing any kind of election violence, which might even mean something relatively minor, like someone throwing a stone at a meeting, down to a full-scale kind of riot where there are multiple people involved. We've also got a graph for number of people who died as well, although they're at relatively small kinds of levels. And what do we see here, looking at the general kind of trend for violence here? Well, we see something quite interesting, I think. We don't have any pre-1832 data, but generally historians have argued that violence in British politics declined quite markedly after the passage of the Great Reform Act of 1832. That the Great Reform Act was, of course, in this Whiggish rendition of British history, was the moment where the aristocracy very sort of cleverly expanded the franchise and quelled some of the very, very considerable major violence that there had been in the early 1830s. But what do we see here? We see violence bumping along throughout the 1840s and the 1850s. And then immediately after the Second Reform Act, which is then when you have the expansion of the franchise to about 2/3 of adult males, which isn't actually prompted by mass violence in Britain. There's a little bit, but it's not like 1832. Suddenly we see an explosion of election violence between the years 1868 to 1885 before it disappears again. Now, the disappearance can, I think, be fairly easily attributed to the passage of the Corrupt and Illegal Practices Act, which makes violence and bribery, for that matter, much, much more punitively punished by the law. But the point here that is interesting is, in precisely the age, the 1860s, 70s and early 80s, which is the time when political parties are becoming the most sophisticated, are becoming the most organised, that we find a huge increase in election violence. And we've done some other analysis as well, that election violence is much more likely to happen in places where the result is close. And so there are some interesting suggestions there that actually some of this violence is likely to have been, rather than just being cultural excitement, to have actually been organised by political parties. Now, with this, there are few smoking guns, for obvious reasons, that will link politicians to the formal illegal organisation of violence. But we do see some very interesting circumstantial evidence that during precisely the time when we would expect election violence to fall, and in places where election violence probably might have the most effect in swinging some votes, we see the most amount of election violence. And then after the election of 1880, which is widely acknowledged to not have so much been violent, but have had a lot of bribery in it, there's this Corrupt and Legal Practices Act, and then violence really kind of collapses, with the exception of there being one little spike there in 1910s, which we might associate perhaps maybe with suffragette violence, although I'm being a bit more speculative there. So, interesting kind of overhead sort of kind of analysis here. So those are some of the sort of things that you can do with it. Very interesting quantitative kind of data. Not the whole picture, of course not, because a vast amount of the picture is in there actually reading the text and understanding, as we have indeed also done, who were these hired roughs, what motivated them, who hired them, what kind of a person was this, all those kind of historical questions. But here's some kind of ways in which we can actually start to answer some of the kind of bigger questions by looking at kind of the general sort of distribution. Now, anyway, so to return to my kind of main argument then, so I think this is quite nice, and I do think that this demonstrates that such tools can be rather indispensable, especially when combined with traditional analysis, which of course I haven't really said much of. But I am of course sort of assuming that such proof, when given by me or given by others, can lead to change. Now, that's what I suppose I have traditionally thought and used to think. But you see, now I'm a little less sure, because I've come to believe that a very considerable obstacle to the adoption of digital analytical methods isn't Luddite skepticism, but it's actually what I would call generally a more sort of an apathy and ambivalence, with historians, not all historians, but many, continuing to ignore a fundamental methodological challenge posed by the second coming of humanities computing. Now, in linguistics and literary studies, this debate began decades ago, involving titans such as Noam Chomsky and Stanley Fish, and that continues. Historians, as I say, still lean heavily on that analysis of Lawrence Stone from 1979, and that's banished computing and clear metrics almost completely from the field, with sympathetic scholars eking out careers as political scientists or in the detached subfield of economic history, which tends to be classified, or at least in Britain, essentially as a social science rather than as a humanities subject. Now, despite the march of technology having greatly weakened many of Stone's arguments from 1979, especially those concerning cost, manpower, technological entry barrier, there seems relatively little appetite still for a reopening of methodological debate on the historian and the computer in the mainstream. Now, as I say, in British political history, digitisation has populated the tree's lowest branches with juicy fruit, and it's never been easier or cheaper to harvest them. Nonetheless, data science in history continues to be labelled as a specialist preoccupation, promoted by a small handful of people like me who end up sounding like salesmen and who are conveniently pigeonholed to footnotes listing alternative approaches, or occasionally, or occasionally asked to attend roundtables on methods as a kind of an example of something different. So, as it was for Shorter in 1971, the computer is forever touted as the future of historical analysis, but somehow never quite yet. Now, in the rest of my remarks, I'm just going to say a little bit more about historians, and then to put on the other foot a little bit about digital humanists as well. Now, starting with historians. Now, in history departments, and I say this primarily with a kind of sort of an Anglo-centric kind of view on this, and you can certainly put me right if this is not the case in France, or to lesser the case, digital humanists can sometimes be viewed as technicians, creating digital assets that enable traditional historians to practice their existing methods more conveniently. Even collaborations that have emphasized big data analysis have often maintained a sharp divide, with computer scientists, data scientists, and software engineers serving historians rather than producing genuinely interdisciplinary scholars who are often the product of digital humanities trainings. Scholars who call themselves digital historians risk finding that their genus will be unapparent to traditional historians, who are generally more preoccupied with place and with period than they are method. This is the effect of provoking a rather exclusionary question I was asked at a recent academic job interview: what kind of a historian are you really? And it seems difficult to imagine other historians from other subfields being asked to justify themselves in that kind of way. Now, I think that this is reflective of a more general retreat from explicit methodological debate amongst political historians, and certainly British political historians. Again, this may not apply so much in France, and please put me right if it does not. In the past, high political historians were actively self-conscious of their focus on key power players at the top of politics, hence the so-called Peterhouse school, where they were interested in political manoeuvres between leaders. Then you have sociological historians working with Marxian, Weberian, or Thomsonian conceptions of social class, again, very aware of method. Similarly, scholars influenced by post-structuralism, whether they're radicals like James Vernon and Patrick Joyce, or moderates like John Lawrence, were very much aware that they were part of a revisionist scholarly movement that became known as the linguistic turn. However, among more recent generations of political historians, interested in intriguing questions such as identities, genders, races, cultures, clear examples of robust methodological debate have disappeared, which seems surprising given the more explicit focus on methods training at undergraduate level. Now, granted, there is considerable interest in new approaches to British political history, for example, black and queer history, but those centre on focus and interpretation rather more than advocating methodological changes in how the past is researched and actually evidenced. Indeed, growing specialism in subject and chronology that we've seen, I think, in many fields of history, and the general reluctance to offer broader explanatory models on causation in British political history have had the effect of siloing recent scholars in niche specialisms, creating a more consensual environment in which historians plough specialist furrows. This has diminished the incentive to reflect in print or in many intriguing general questions which remain unresolved, including but not limited to why class became so unfashionable a historical focus in British political history, whether it still should be, why historians of politics have been replaced with historians of political culture, why history and the social sciences continue to diverge methodologically when we often study the same sources, why quantitative history has been beaten to the fringes of the discipline, how and why so many historians moved towards reconstructing the past and away from explaining it, and why it is that, despite such favourable wins, there has yet been no second coming of computing in history or an associated revival of clear metrics. Now, the methodological debates surrounding computing have been sidestepped, I would suggest, to such an extent that there has been negligible introspection even on room-devouring elephants. For example, how overworked historians can avoid succumbing to the lure of search interfaces, which can plunder digital archives for quotations to order to support pre-existing positions through jet-propelled cherry-picking. And that's to say nothing of rapid advances in artificial intelligence and, of course, ChatGPT-4, which I haven't mentioned. Now that, ChatGPT could, of course, be the topic of a paper in itself, because it's transformed public discussion of artificial intelligence. Now, in the humanities, we've perhaps had to take a little bit more notice of this because of its ability to help students cheat at essays. But ChatGPT has other enormously controversial powers, such as its ability to expand and indeed even create new sources where we do not have them. For example, from domains where there are very few, such as Aboriginal history. And indeed to role-play a simulated historical actor for us to ask them questions. Now, while deprived as ChatGPT still is of the vast majority of the historical record due to copyright, it is probably the most powerful single force that might drive historians to taking textual analysis as seriously as I think they should do. Now, there are many excellent and vital arguments which lean on Stone and some which are new on why historians should leave methods like mine, not to mention ChatGPT, behind the cordon sanitaire. Such arguments include the proclivity of such methods to present glorified statements of the obvious, produce conclusions from arbitrary categories, reliance on various statistical algorithmic black boxes, their tendency to tell stories of majorities rather than minorities, and their potential to diminish the human story at the heart of history. And then with AI, there are vital questions which take us right back to Foucault and Derrida about the nature of truth in history. However, I think those concerns should be a stimulus to use digital methods more effectively rather than to ignore them. A failure to do so risks the arrival of a new generation of aggressively empirical and much less polite scholarship that risks pushing history uncritically towards data science, where the past is treated merely as a crunchable data repository with which to solve the problems of the present. The time has come to have a debate on method, and we need Luddites to make a strong case against these techniques that doesn't just rely on a critique that was brilliant but is about 50 years old. However, I also suggest that where the status quo is found wanting, it should change, and that debate would be assisted by taking digital history seriously as a subfield and recognising that while asking its practitioners for methodological introspection is reasonable, that it requires historians to accept that methodological contributions to scholarship are not, per se, less valuable than contributions at the level of content. Now, at present, I don't think it's the case, and I think methodological work, again, perhaps I say this with an Anglo-centric focus, is afforded a second-class status by journals and on the job market, whose criteria is mainly based on subject and period. I would suggest that a historian who contributes nothing to content, but profoundly to method, should be rewarded with the same accolades of those whose contribution is the reverse, to make a provocative claim. Now, history departments' priorities, to say at least in the UK, I do think require some refocusing. Now, our grant-making bodies have definitely not been Luddite in their focus, and much money is given to digital humanities projects and resources. But the digital turn has had very little effect in transforming undergraduate curricula. Undergraduate historians are not taught text mining, database design, visualization, spatial humanities, or coding. They are not taught basic inferential statistics and are not introduced to any of the fundamental analytical paradigms which predominate in social and political science research. Oxford University's wide-ranging disciplines of history, undergraduate method course, which I teach, lacks any classes on digital history at all, and the same is true of Cambridge's equally wide-ranging history, argument, and practice. The prevailing attitude seems to be that digital history is interesting enough for postgraduates to be worthy even of its own dedicated master's programs, as it often is, but it is not something which undergraduates should be exposed to. I think this disparity misses the potential for students trained in historical data science to graduate with better rounded skill sets that STEM-biased employers might value. Right, now I put the boot on the other foot and talk about the digital humanities very briefly. Now, how do digital humanities scholars sometimes characterize historians? Now, I think perhaps the greatest error of digital humanists has been to erect a false dichotomy between progressive digital and reactionary non-digital scholars, which stifles its ability to speak to the whole discipline. Now, few constituencies of brilliant technologists, as digital humanists are, can entirely restrain their Whiggish impulses. And for a long time, they've considered themselves a vanguard with a moral imperative to delineate the arc of progress. Now, while this introspection is invariably thoughtful, provocative, and challenging, the digital humanities' reputation for jarring evangelism since the millennium has not been unwarranted. An example is a 2009 report entitled "The Digital Future is Now, a Call to Action in the Humanities," which contended that the non-digital historian, pejoratively caricatured as a non-collaborating lone scholar, should evolve 21st century methodologies rather than spending months or years alone in the dusty archive. More zealous and self-confrontational was the Digital Humanities Manifesto 2.0, which criticised traditional disciplines as bastions of small thinking, clerical privilege, and intellectual policing, unable to adapt to the digital age on account of their cognitive conservatism, nostalgia, and institutional inertia. Now, the much discussed scholarly reluctance, particularly in history, to adapt digital methods was indeed the subject of a diagnosis in P.F. Wouter's study, Conservative Cultural Diverging Identities, Studying Resistance to Change and Technology in Academia. Another report on scholarly practices in the humanities solemnly concluded that none of the participants in our study is yet ready to abandon print and manuscript in favour of digital ones. Such behaviours are likely to persist for some time. The History Manifesto 2014 is perhaps the best known entry in this sort of canon of digital humanities activism that I've described, and that also, in the course of making many important points, did much to ruffle important feathers and encouraged a debate, albeit one that's rather petered out in the field. Now, the obvious downside of this confrontational approach, which has been adopted by the digital humanities, has been polarization, since it encourages scholars to fortify themselves in respective fields and avoid interaction. The decision of the digital humanities in itself to become a separate discipline, and within history, the evolution of digital history as a separate subfield, has created departments, research networks and conferences which primarily support or engage those who have already taken the digital turn. Journal articles by digital historians usually appear in specialist outlets: History and Computing, Culture and History Digital Journal, Literary and Linguistic Computing, Digital Humanities Quarterly, monographs and edited collections which are invariably dedicated to digital history itself rather than particular historical topics. Additionally, a great deal of this work is published online in blogs, in discussion groups, such as the Programming Historian, and through digital colloquia. Now, those are all channels that are unlikely to engage historians who do not liberally seek them out. Indeed, practitioners of digital history are often linguists, computer scientists, literary scholars, or library and information studies professionals before they are historians. To the digital humanist, the interdisciplinary enhances the richness of their field and ameliorates methodological and epistemological inertia. But to historians, they risk being perceived as a ragtag group of scholars from fields who have accidentally stumbled into history. Now, existing as a separate discipline offers digital humanities scholars much needed support for pioneering interdisciplinary research and methodological debate, and that's great, but at the same time I also think it weakens their ability to reach out to these oft caricatured lone scholars who, for better or worse, continue to represent the majority of historians. The proponents of digital methods are thus perhaps too often guilty of preaching to the converted and failing to engage mainstream historians. One final way in which I think that we digital historians haven't done ourselves any favours is by shrouding endeavours in excessive technological mystique. This fuels the perception that these methods are open only to specialists, namely scholars with expertise in programming, statistics, and most perniciously of all, only those who are in receipt of huge grants for digital resource creation or involved in big multidisciplinary projects. Lone historians who simply want to dabble in digital methods. For example, maybe you want to use text mining as an auxiliary part of a traditional project, are frightened away rather than encouraged. Indeed, John Unsworth, the pioneer of what was once called humanities computing, described such dabbling scholars as charlatans because they undersell the market by providing a quick and dirty simulacrum of something that, if done right, is expensive, time-consuming and difficult. Now, in his defence, Unsworth was talking about literary studies, a field where numerous have-a-go digital scholars have produced substandard scholarship. But in history, I think the opposite problem is true, and scholars are afraid to even try their hand. Important pedantic discussions on digital resource creation, whether it's about text encoding protocols having been followed, metadata having been properly marked up, or whether optical character recognition falls below certain thresholds, similarly serve to dissuade curious scholars from considering how far and in what ways even very simple text mining might help augment their research. In reality, I think the main question is choosing the right sort of research question and deploying the outputs of computational analysis in persuasive historical argument alongside other techniques. Because on a technical level, all that's really needed to begin analysis on the simple end of the spectrum is a large text, good quality optical character recognition, and pieces of free graphical interface, user interface software such as AntConc. A focus, I think, on promoting digital analytical methodologies as supporters rather than as leaders of otherwise traditional historical projects might help convince more adventurous historians that they can have a go with this without taking the full plunge. In conclusion then, so I've pulled no punches in outlining a case that might be applied to many fields of history, not just modern French and British history. But I do think that British political history, to talk about my own subject, could form a vanguard of a second coming of computational analysis in the wider discipline, not just because of its amenability and its sources and the research questions to quantitative analysis, but also because it is entirely in keeping with our rich tradition of methodological innovation. The focus on high politics borrowed from prosopography and psychoanalysis. Electoral sociology lent heavily on political science. The new political history was indebted to literary theory and philosophy. Those innovations and many others did not occur without substantial methodological debate on what allied disciplines could teach us, and this also required a pragmatic appetite to embrace the new where it deserved to be embraced. So the first wave of historical computing that we heard about with Edward Shorter may have failed, and perhaps the second one will too. But it shouldn't be condemned before an apathy of a jury of apathy and ambivalence. Let us have this debate, but to do so, we require the so-called Luddites to come forward and politely or otherwise reply. It is their intervention, not that of advocates like me, which can really stimulate this urgently needed debate on where we might go with analytical computing in history, and perhaps, more importantly, where it might stop. Thank you.